Well, welcome everybody. This is our third in a series about releases, record releases. And I asked our friend Jay Gilbert to join us today. Jay is an old friend of ours and is really super knowledgeable about marketing and how to actually make money. I'm good at spending money. Jay's good at making money, so it's a nice parallel, you know. So Jay, welcome to the Artist Rights Institute, and tell us a little bit about your background, and then we'll talk about marketing plans.
Sure. Thank you, my friend. I'm a longtime music industry guy. I worked record retail for about 8 years, and then I've worked with labels distribution for about the last 35 years. I spent 18 years at Universal. And about 10 years ago, I started a newsletter called Your Morning Coffee, sort of to curate all the music news. And it wasn't designed for that purpose, but it really helped me to secure clients and to meet smart people like you, Chris. And for the last 5 years or so, we've done the podcast version of it. And just really quickly, I do two other podcasts besides Your Morning Coffee. I do Behind the Set List with Billboard Magazine with Glenn Peoples, which is so much fun. And I do a podcast for DIY artists with Mike Brandvold called Music Biz Weekly. So I'm a music industry consultant. Primarily, I work with artist managers, but I work with some data platforms and a couple of labels as well, just to help them with their strategy and their planning and, give them an extra set of hands.
Great. Well, and that's sort of what we want to talk about today, because as we go through talking to artists and dealing with artists and working with artists, who are releasing their own records in particular, and sometimes even with their labels. Although you wouldn't think it would happen that way, but many times it does. That there seems to be a hunger for knowing more about how do I actually do this? What pieces do I have to set in motion at what point in time in order to
Right.
have it all come down to a focal point?
Yeah.
And how do I manage that audience and so on. So, Jay, you've got some really great slides on this and have a lot of background in this. So why don't you give us a little taste of the basics about what you want to make sure that you cover when
Sure.
you're leading up to a release, which you will have invested a ton of money and time into. So you want to try
Exactly.
to have it be successful with the public.
Excellent. I will share some slides here in a second. I just wanted to point out that this is a perfect companion to a piece that you put out recently, Chris, the Artist Guide to Record Releases Part One. I think you have to walk before you can run. And I think, doing that blocking and tackling and doing those basic things that you need to do first is super important. And then this is sort of the next step. So I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to show you about 10 slides out of a deck that I use called the Your Morning Coffee Roadshow. And I will hit play, and hopefully you can see that now.
Yep.
And this is, again, one piece of a larger presentation, but it's the core things. This is what we start with when I talk to artists, managers, labels, distributors. Um, this is where we start. So right now, let's see, we've got the main slide here.
And just
There
for
we
people
go.
who are listening to this on the audio podcast, we're going to make these slides available on the website. So if you'll look in the show notes for the podcast and you'll find the link.
Yeah, let me go to where we want to be, which is right here. And then, sorry, I thought I had it set. Let's try this one more time. There we go. Okay. So, I'm sharing my screen. So hopefully, Chris, you can see that okay.
Yes.
All right. So the first thing we start with is this great quote from Jonathan Daniel. Um, and the reason we start with this quote, Jonathan works at Crush and they manage, Miley Cyrus, Sia, Green Day, Panic. And I heard him say this one time and I quickly wrote it down because The quote is, if you can't see it, if you're just listening, it says, if I have a great song, my job is easy. If I have a good song, my job is impossible. And the reason I bring that up is because today, when you release music, if you're a new artist, developing artist, you're releasing music right alongside, Drake and the Chainsmokers and, Chapel Roan. So you better look as good and you better sound as good. So it's got to be great. So that's the first thing. What are the next six things? And these are the slides that I want to talk to you about. And they're in this order for a reason. So as you're planning your release cycle, and hopefully you've done all the things, that Chris has suggested that you do in part one, the next thing is you need to set goals, right? And the goals are so important. Here are those next six things, by the way. And for those of you who are, again, for listening, the six things are goals, narrative, audience, release cadence, strategy and planning, and creative. So let's start with goals. Everybody has different goals. If you talk to an EDM artist, it might be about festivals and streaming. If you talk to a jazz artist, it may be about accolades, winning a Grammy, being on the cover of Jazz Is, Jazz Times, Downbeat, that sort of thing. Everybody has their own goals. It could be financial. Um, but we like to get those goals down on paper. Is there a tour involved, right? Are we looking to increase our social footprint, our merch sales, whatever that is? Maybe this is the record you've always wanted to make, and that's your goal, is just to get it out in the world. Whatever it is, let's capture that so later we can look back and see, did we overperform? Did we underperform? That sort of thing. So goals are number one. The next part that a lot of people miss is the narrative. And the narrative is so important today that if we were to release a record today, we would go into, let's say, Spotify's submission tool, for example. There's a place there for narrative. It's really important. Basically, it's, why should anybody care? Is this about overcoming adversity? Is there a political bent to it? Is this about who you're playing with? There's a narrative about who this artist is and what this release is about. And sometimes you need a publicist to sort of pull that out of you. Maybe they interview you. If you don't have the money, or you're a developing artist and don't have a publicist, you can talk to your family and your friends, but you really need to figure out what sets you apart as an artist. What is that narrative? And what I mean by that is, let's say you had 30 seconds in an elevator to tell somebody about who you are as an artist, what you stand for, what you're about, what your sound is, what genre, mood, whatever. If you can capture that and everybody on your team has that, it just amplifies that message. The other thing is that it's got to be authentic. Just because, Billie Eilish is a hit, you can't come out and just imitate her and that's your narrative. It's got to be authentic and genuine. People can smell it a mile away if it's not. And then I use this example of narrative from when I was growing up. One of the first albums I ever bought was Cheap Trick's debut album. And to this day, when you buy it on vinyl and you pull the sleeve out, it's got their cool classic logo on one side of the sleeve. And when you flip it over, it's all text. And it's the story of Cheap Trick, how they formed. Now, I would say 80% of it is made up. And I'm not suggesting that you be dishonest. I'm just saying that what happened to that was magazines and newspapers and radio stations, they just, they're lazy, and some of them. And so they would just grab from that narrative as though it were fact. So you control your narrative. So use that power wisely. The next one, which is, some people would say this is the second most important thing. I think it's third. And that is really finding out who your audience is, or knowing who your audience is. I was at this leadership music thing in Nashville a couple years ago, and Keith Urban said, write a hit song and you'll have a moment, build an audience and you'll have a career. And I couldn't agree more. And so how do you do that? Well, you find your tribe. We've got someone like Seth Godin, who is, if you're not watching this, he's on this slide. I had him on the podcast, and really insightful guy. He's written about a dozen best-selling books on marketing, but he had this quote, and I put it in the slide. People like us do things like this, meaning that if you go to a Taylor Swift show, you're exchanging bracelets, you're dressing a certain way, you're singing along, you're part of a tribe. If you back when Jimmy Buffett was around, it was, the Parrot Heads, the BTS Army, whatever it is, people like us do things like this. You build that tribe. I often talk about three audiences to sort of illustrate to people how you find your audience. So I drop the audience into three buckets. One is the butts in the seats. When you're standing on stage and you look out, who's in the audience? Are they male, female, young, old? Like, what is that demographic? You can learn a lot by looking at who's at your live shows. That's audience number one. Number two, social media. It's pretty easy to track social media, YouTube, TikTok, all of that. There's insights to gain there. Spotify for artists, Apple Music for artists, all those things. There's so many things, so many ways you can get information on your audience. And the last one is commerce, like who is actually streaming, who is buying the products, whether it's music, merch, experiences, whatever that stuff is. Those are your three audiences, and they don't always overlap completely. So there's a lot to learn about how you're going to target your marketing depending on who your audience is. And if you're trying to figure out who your audience is, think about what kind of artists would you like to open for? What kind of artists would you like to open for you? Who would you like to co-write with? Those types of things. And then it's pretty easy to look online and see who your like competitive artists are. Like you go onto your DSP of choice, and a lot of times they'll say, oh, people who listen to this also listen to this. So you can get a sense. And you can use platforms like Viberate and Chartmetric and some of those platforms to dig a little bit deeper if you're going to. So that's audience. And the last thing I'll say on audience is here's some different types of audiences. We talk about super fans a lot, right? And they're going to be tiers on Spotify where you pay more. Tencent is, making 5 times the revenue right now with their super fan tier. But you have different tools and tactics to reach a hardcore fan versus someone you want to reignite or someone who has never heard of you. And I had a manager tell me one time that this is actually very simple. There's only 2 reasons people are not buying your new album or going to see you live. Reason number one is they've heard of you, they love you, they just didn't know your show or your album was happening. That can be fixed with marketing. Number two is they've never heard of you, right? Again, that's one of those things that marketing can help. So here are the different types of targets, and there's different tools for each one. So now we're going to get into something, Chris, you and I were talking about this because it's evolved and changed so much over the last few years. And this is the release cadence. So do you need to put out an album unless there's demand in the marketplace? Probably not. It might make more sense to put out a series of tracks. And the great thing about putting out a track every 4 to 6 weeks is if one starts to overperform, you can pump the brakes and just wait until you release the next track. I like to use the example we did with Vintage Trouble because I think it just opens people's minds to a different type of release cadence. And the short version for the Vintage Trouble release, they delivered 10 songs and they wanted to release an album. That's what they had always done. But we wanted to reignite their base in the United States versus ex-US, where they were doing really well. But they're from California and they had spent so much time outside of the United States that we felt like we needed to reignite that base. So we took those 10 songs and we broke them up into 2 5-song EPs. Okay, that's pretty simple. And then we'd have focus tracks leading up to those. But we took it a step further. We took the first EP, those exact same songs, and we built another EP of those songs reimagined, meaning acoustic versions, reggae versions, bluesy versions, totally different versions, but of the exact same songs. Now we have two EPs with focus tracks leading up to it, maybe every 4 weeks or so. Then for the second EP, we put together a live EP of those same 5 songs live in concert. So now we have 5-song EPs with focus tracks leading up to it. And instead of dropping a couple of focus tracks and then the album, we had things to talk about, post about, make videos about for 18 months. And it really
Yeah.
helped.
Yeah. And, as I'm listening to you, there's a timing issue with some of this stuff, right? Which is that if you're going to release an album that you've probably already finished recording the album, there's going to be some situations where you haven't finished recording the album, but you want to keep your audience alive, and have these sort of audience warmer events over the time that you're working on the album before you get it ready to release.
Yeah.
So there's sort of layers of this, which gets to something which I tell everybody, which is record everything, record every single thing,
Yes.
right? Rehearsals, live
Behind the
shows,
scenes.
behind the scenes, all of it. And if you're
Yeah.
sitting around, and you're playing the song on acoustic, maybe it's a piano song and you played it on guitar one night, or whatever it is, record it all. You don't have to have multi-track recordings, just something decent that you can use in a streaming environment or something that doesn't have a lot of, fidelity pressure,
Yeah.
but it's stuff you can use.
Yeah.
And that because there's never a time when you won't find a use for, what we used to call B-sides and rarities, right?
Well,
I mean,
100%.
right, right. I mean, so, and label it, be able to find it, you
That's
know,
the hard part.
yeah, right. But just think in terms of being able to record, on the tour bus, at the show, behind the scenes, wherever, and then be
100%.
able to store that. And, at some point, you'll say, what would be great right there would be this. You're not going to pitch that for sync licenses, and you're not going to use it to try to, you know, get on the radio necessarily, but
Yeah.
you
It's
never know.
it's great
Always give the
advice.
example of More Than
Yeah.
Words, right? More Than
Yeah.
Words was kind of a fluke, right? And it was or if you don't know the track, it was a single by a band called Extreme, which is Nuno Betancourt, where pretty much where Nuno Betancourt started, I think. And fabulous band. Nuno, obviously, fierce guitar player, always was fierce guitar
Yeah.
player, right? And great singer. And so these guys in Extreme sat around one time and came up with this very pop, very, I mean, I don't mean this in a cruel way, but kind of schmaltzy, song, More Than Words, right? And typical love song. And that thing took off. It was guitar and voice,
Yeah.
you
Acoustic.
know, it was acoustic. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, this is a metal band, and now our hit is an acoustic love song that
Yeah.
could
It
be
was
Cole
huge.
Porter, right?
Yeah.
But you know what? That's the challenge of marketing. Is like if that's the card you're given, you got to find a way to make that work.
Yeah.
And so the moral of the story is keep these tracks around for these mini campaigns,
Yeah.
and this it feeds into this always on concept,
Yes.
right?
Yep. I couldn't agree with you more. And I would add only that you're talking about audio. I would say that pertains to video, photos.
Oh
And
yeah,
while you're
right.
while you're in the studio, if you're in the studio in the summertime, don't forget to record that holiday song. Don't forget to record that cover that you're talking to your bandmates about, all of this stuff will play into it later. So that is release cadence. The next part, this is number 5 of 6, is strategy and planning. And it's super important, but I'll tell you, it doesn't have to be super complicated. We always tell people to start with their street team. Even Taylor Swift still has that same street team. Well, what is a street team? That's when you surround yourself with people who work with you. Maybe they work for you. Maybe they're friends, family, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever it is. But as you're starting out, that core group surrounding you, we call that your street team, right? And they will move mountains for you. But what makes a street team work is when everybody knows what their roles and their responsibilities are. Maybe somebody's really good at short form video editing. Let them handle that. And they know that they're the point person for that. Maybe one of them's a photographer. Maybe one of them is really good in the studio. Whatever their superpower is, you surround yourself with those people. That's number one. But number two, make sure everybody knows whose roles and responsibilities. Some people are really good with social media. Some are really good with, posting or creating assets and things like that. You'll avoid a lot of confusion by just making sure everybody knows what their role is. The next part I'll get into in the next slide is this marketing planner versus marketing plan. And that's basically, I took a lot of marketing plans that I had seen over the years, laid them out on a table and had a yellow pad and a pen, and I jotted down what was in each marketing plan. And I'll share this with you in a second. And what I found was they were all about 80, 90% the same. They all had, when the release was coming, why it was important, what the narrative was, maybe who the publicist is there going to be a tour, what are some of the tools that we're going to use. But what I found, at least at the major label level, is sometimes they were theater, meaning that we would have a big meeting and the product manager would present this marketing plan to management, to the label, to the publishing people, whatever it is. And it was wonderful, beautiful slides, charts and graphs, awe-inspiring, but then you would never hear about it again. It was never referred to again. In fact, 6 months later, you didn't go back and look and go, did we achieve those goals? Did we do those brand partnerships? Did we do the things we said we were going to do? So I decided to sort of scrap that old school mentality and do this marketing planner, which is coming next. So I'll show you that. So, and I'll be more than happy to share this with you. It's evolving. I think it's on version 35. There's a little section at the very end of it for metadata, which if you've ever set up a release in a distribution system or a label system, you'll go in and you'll start putting in data and you're like, oh, I don't have the publishing splits, or oh, I don't have the whatever. But if you pay attention to Chris's part 1, where you sort of get locked and loaded with all of those things, and then just make sure that you're sort of prepared before you go into those systems. So this is broken up by, what do you need to do 6 months out? What do you need to do 3 months out? And it looks like a form that you fill out, but it's not. It's just to guide your weekly meetings with your team. So let's say I'm meeting with Chris. I pull this up every week and I go, oh, Chris, we were looking to get those instrumental versions for sync. Did your guy get those? Oh, yeah, I've got those. They're in the shared drive. Okay, I can check that off. It keeps all of these moving parts together. So I highly recommend either you use this release planner or create one of your own, but have something that you look at every single week versus something you look at once in a meeting that makes everybody feel good.
If I can just interject on that,
Sure.
this is sort of like what is called the key date schedule at
Hmm.
a record company. And basically what it is that you need to have a roadmap to keep 5 or 6 departments of the label on track with any particular release. And that would be, you know, production, which is going to be what you call sales or manufacturing in some places, but it's the people who actually make the physical records when you have physical records, or it's the people who get the digital assets ready to push out. It'll be the promotion department. It'll be the marketing department. It'll be um, press, right? It'll be creative services. It'll be all these different departments that you have to have all singing from the same hymn book, and then international, right? So what you're doing if you're putting your own record out is you're basically doing all those functions, and they all have to kind of have some place to come together. And that place where they come together is the marketing, the release planner,
Yeah.
and what we used to call the key date schedule, because that way you could put it all on a timeline. It might
Yeah.
shift around a little bit, but basically you put it all on a timeline. So that way, if you're going to press, then you've already serviced them. You've already serviced the press department, right, with music that they can then send out. If they don't have the music, there's not anything to send out, right? Or if they don't have the video
Right.
assets, if your video department doesn't have the video assets, there's nothing for them to send out. And then that screws up the whole thing. So
Right.
this is no different than what's done by the biggest and richest entities out there. It's just that you're having to do it yourself if you're at the other end of the chain, and it means you have to work a bit harder and be a little bit more coordinated. But you're basically doing the same kinds of things that Taylor Swift is doing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all about the planning. And then the last part of this, Chris, is just about creative. And we're all visual beings. It's so important. So let's look at that slide. I'm a photographer. I've shot a bunch of album covers. I have a studio. I've been doing this for decades. And I've learned that people will sort of hear your music, hear your releases, but they listen with their eyes first. They look at that artwork online, or they look at the advertisement or the track cover or the short form video or whatever it is. People may attach to you first by that visual. And I believe that you should hear the image. And what that means is your imagery, photos of you, videos of you, you know you should be able to hear the music with the sound off. That a country artist sounds a certain way. That when you listen to someone who looks heavy metal or whatever it is, that that imagery should match the music and be super consistent. And the other thing about consistency is your social media, all those banners, your DSPs, all those avatars and banners. Avatar just means your artist image. They should be consistent across all those platforms, because then it amplifies your message. So I always recommend that people reduce the size of their art. So on this slide, you can see what certain album art and track art looks like on a laptop versus on a phone. When you look on your phone, it's going to be a postage stamp sized artwork, and you want it to still pop, right? You don't want it to be muddy. If you look at this example, you can see on the top right hand corner, there's Shania Twain's album covers. You can see those from 30 feet away, and you can tell what they are, and they really pop. They're really bright, great use of white space, all of those things. So I highly encourage people, as you're looking at your releases, your focus tracks will have cover art typically. You'll have an EP cover, album cover, whatever that is. And people forget that when you post videos, let's say to YouTube, you control the thumbnail. It'll automatically pick one for you, but you can go in and put any image you want as your thumbnail. So it's really important, because 80% of the spins on YouTube come from the right rail, meaning people are watching something and then they sort of glance over to that right rail and go, oh, that looks cool. Or it'll automatically feed something to them. So this is a matter of commerce to make sure that your imagery is uh, is buttoned up. And that is this portion of the roadshow. And I will go to unshare my screen. Of course, I've lost my cursor. There we go. And there it is. And I will stop.
Well,
And
that's
that's
great,
it,
buddy.
Chris.
Thanks, Jay. And that
Yeah, yeah.
it's super important for people to, I think, to get their minds around this, and we can all do better. I mean, it's not a perfect process. God knows. And you try for the best, but it's like, like Mike Tyson says, everybody's got a plan until they get hit in the mouth, I mean, it tends to unravel, but the more planning you have, the better discipline you're going to have, and the more
Yeah,
likely it is you're going to be able to roll with those punches when they come in.
absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Cool. Any last words you want to
Well,
impart?
you just brought up something I think is really important is that nothing
Boxing?
ever goes according to plan. Well, boxing too, you know, but the harder I work, the luckier I get.
Yes.
If you do
Right.
this planning, it will just solve so many problems because at the end of the day, things are going to break.
Yeah.
There are going to be problems. There might be some, content ID thing on YouTube that's saying, oh, you don't have the rights to this. And I mean, there's always things that pop up. But if you do what you put in your artist guide to record releases and get locked and loaded there, if you do some planning on your marketing side, and if you partner with your label and your distributor, sometimes some really good things will happen. But you want good partners, whether it's your attorney, whether it's your publicist, whether it's your sync licensing, whoever it is, your label, your distributor, a lot of their value is going to be problem solving, right?
Yes.
And
Oh yeah.
so
Well, I'll give
it's
you a good example, and we can close on this. So many years ago, when I was at A&M, I made the mistake of answering the phone on the afternoon of the Wednesday before Thanksgiving,
oh boy,
which I advise against
rookie
in
move.
all cases. Yeah, rookie move. Yeah. And it was somebody from Polygram in Germany calling me asking for the ISRC for a Bon Jovi track that had appeared on Very Special Christmas, which was a series of Christmas albums, fabulous series
Yeah.
actually of Christmas recordings that we had put out to benefit Bobby Schreiber and Special Olympics. Well,
Yep.
Special
Huge.
Olympics, which was managed by Bobby Schreiber. And that was coming out as the B-side of Bon Jovi's single in Germany. And there was a German pressing plant that would not press the Bon Jovi single because there was no ISRC for the Very Special Christmas B-side. Wednesday afternoon before Thanksgiving, which it wasn't Thanksgiving in Germany, needless to say.
Oh
So
my gosh.
I then had to, and of course, the trick was that the Very Special Christmas albums came out right as the ISRC was starting to come into use. So we didn't have an ISRC for that recording because it was pre-ISRC.
Oh man.
And a matter of fact, we had never set up an ISRC for Very Special Christmas because we hadn't put out a new one since the system came into effect. So I had to pick up the phone and call a friend of mine at the RAAA and get the RAAA to issue. Uh,
Were they in the office?
yeah. Well,
Oh my.
no, they weren't, but one of them was, but the
Oh my
others were
God.
not, and so they had to be reached at home, and we could because it's two letters, it's a two-letter code, right? And but without that, that Bon Jovi single was not coming out, and it wasn't coming out with the B side, and the whole point was to have the Christmas song on the B side, right? Because he didn't want to put
Right.
out a Christmas record, but he wanted to have a Christmas track, right?
Yes.
So yeah, and so we managed to get it done. It took about mm, three of the longest hours of my life to actually get it done, soup to nuts, and allow the record to get pressed on time because, like everything else, if that pressing had slipped, you know,
Sure.
lots of other things would have slipped,
Of
right?
course.
Because
All of the
Bon Jovi at
surrounding
that time was
marketing.
Bon
Oh my
Jovi,
gosh. Yeah.
yeah, super hot. So anyway, it's all these things go together, right?
Yes, they do.
All these things go together, and the more you can plan, you know, the better off you're going to be in the long run.
Yep. There's the moral. Yep.
All right. So Jay, so how do people find you? What if people want to, what's your social media? Where do they find you online?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me, it's the easiest URL in the world. It's yourmorning.coffee. And
Yourmorning.com. A
yeah,
fabulous podcast. I highly recommend it.
thank you. Checks in the mail.
And it's been, but it's been consistently great for
Thank
years
you.
now. So I highly recommend it. All right, guys. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you taking the time, Jay.
My pleasure.
And we will post all this stuff on the website and stay tuned for the next installment of our record release series.